Welcome. This is Jammin' on Jamstack. My name's Mike Neumegen, and any day I get to talk about static websites and Jamstack is a good day. And doing it with Mr. Jamstack himself, that's a great day. I want to welcome the CEO of Netlify, coiner of Jamstack, Biilmann, to the show. Welcome.
Thanks, man. Great initiatives, and like I'm also always happy to chat Jamstack, modern web technology, architecture, futures of web, any of those.
Yeah, for sure. I want to start with the story about how we met. So it's 2015. We're both in San Francisco. You founded Biilmann and Webpop and a few things in the space. Just started Netlify. And the first thing I saw from you is this static website meetup, web tech meetup. I'm like, oh, yeah. Someone doing stuff in static sites. That's amazing. And so I sign up, turn up to your office in Dogpatch, San Francisco. You open the door for me. We come in. We spend the evening talking about static sites. There's pizza. Yeah. It's me, you, and your co-founder, Chris, and two other people.
That absolutely, like the two other people, like I'm pretty sure were there for the pizza mainly.
Perhaps, but what could be better than that? Static sites and pizza. That's the dream. That was really cool, and it's pretty incredible reflecting on what's happened since then.
Yeah, it was really early days before, like I'd gotten Chris to join me on this journey coming over from Denmark. We're sort of figuring out the whole, how do we talk about it? We started this like static web tech SF meetup in the very first edition. I gave a talk to you and the two other guys that, as I said, were probably mostly there for the pizza, but still it was an audience.
Pizza's a big draw.
It online and so on. And then just started building on those kind of things, bringing interesting people together, talking about like the space around us. And for context, right? Like I have been building web platforms for a long time, actually, right? Like I was CEO of a company in Spain where we built several iterations of our internal web platform because we were delivering websites for mainly small to medium businesses in Spain and in Europe, but not with like an agency model where we had the team that would go build those sites. We had like a network of freelance designers that would do the actual design work, but then my organization really built that platform that the designers would use to design with, that every customer used as to manage content, and that powered every single website from brief to production. We had a lot of different architectural approaches to that one. And then I started Webpop, as you said. There was like a CMS company building a full, like a cloud-hosted multi-tenant CMS, but with a lot of those kind of like qualities that I've always argued, right? Like, so they had this very strong decoupling between the design and code layer and then the content layer on the other perspective. It had in 2010 serverless functions in JavaScript. Like write a common.js file and call it from any of your templates just by mentioning the exported functions and so on. But it was still like one multi-tenant dynamic app running everything. And I just had in that time really started building the conviction, in part looking at like the first headless CMSs that came out, right? Like in this API-ification of a lot of things, that separation of concerns really made sense to me. And that separating like the whole front end part from all the back end and the business logic and so on was really the way to go. And I was even considering at the time, should I like take the CMS part of Webpop and build like headless CMS? But there was already a couple of people doing that. there wasn't any people building like the platform for where, how should you actually build and deploy and operate your front end in that world. And build like a small MVP that was Biilmann, where I really just like set myself the goal. Let me try to build a solution to that in like 2 weeks. Built that, shipped it, like spent another 2 weeks adding some pricing and so on, and got it out there. And again, really focusing on static sites at the time, right? Like there was no, in that setup, there was no serverless functions or anything, but it captured this idea of like, you can just write the front end and deploy to there, and there's nothing else in between, right? Like, and then started talking to Chris, that was one of my best friends back from high school in Denmark, and that was at the time sitting as chief digital officer at a large agency, about like all of the advantages of this architectural approach. Especially at the time, like the advantages in terms of security was a really big one, right? Like there was just so, like the systems at the time, like WordPress, Drupal, and so on, they just got hacked all the time. And it was like your backend that got hacked from it, right? Like, and he had this horror story where they had built this whole super expensive Drupal project for a large client. And it took the launch, for different reasons, got like pushed with 6 months or something. So that Drupal site was sitting around, not really monitored.
Yeah.
And when they were about to go live, the whole system has been hacked and everything was gone. And there was nothing to launch, right? Like there was so many, like there's just so many stories of that at the time, right? Like
meanwhile,
that was,
you have a Jekyll site from 2008, still good.
They'll still be good, right? Like it'll still be good. There won't be any problems, right? Like, and the same in terms of scalability, where like, again, he had also just seen so many of those where, again, maybe they put out some campaign site like that, and then it goes close to end of year, and the CMO from the company has like extra budget and send up like a massive, like performance marketing campaign driving traffic to this page. And no one has really optimized it.
Yeah.
So suddenly it goes down, and there's just like a massive crisis, because like now there's a big budget at stake, and like, how do you optimize it and so on, right? Like maintenance problems, again, from like the constant need to update. And meanwhile, while you're constantly updating, the stuff you're updating has changed and so on. So you get into these like cycles of just having to spend most of your time keeping up with the changes in whatever system you're using, right? There was just such a long list of problems that I felt we could solve by decoupling the whole stateless part from all the backend infrastructure part, and initially really doing it as purely static front ends. Over time, obviously, we added much more capabilities to that stack that makes it more like of a spectrum, going from like pure static to like today sometimes purely dynamic but still decoupled, and sometimes falling right back into like, let's just build everything full stack, which I'm not a big believer in, obviously.
Yeah, no, fascinating. So like, what was the build up to coining the term Jamstack? Like, why did you feel like that was needed? Why couldn't we just talk about static websites and these sort of things?
I mean, genuinely, because we didn't think what we were doing was just about static websites, right? Like, we were looking at this as a broader architectural change that had to do with decoupling the experience layer, like the actual web UI layer, from the backend business logic layer, and having that layer start to split into APIs and services. And we saw that across, like, we saw that as a different set of trends, where obviously for like marketing sites and so on, it made a lot of sense to build them as static sites and push them out. For applications, we saw progressive web apps and single page applications start becoming like a thing that could allow you to get the same architectural decoupling between the two parts. and we saw this whole landscape of like the first headless CMSs come out, and the first, could almost call them like headless APIs for authentication and stuff like that come out, right? Like, and it was early there, but I believe that would spread into to a lot of different areas. I talked quite a bit with the Firebase people as well initially. Actually, like, as an ancient backstory, when Firebase launched Firebase hosting, the first beta version of that was like a reseller account of Biilmann.
Wow.
But with a very similar vision of like, we're gonna like have like databases that are basically much just an API that you call out to, instead of being like an integrated part of like some big monolithic application, right? Like, so I really saw it as more than, like, I saw static sites as like a subset of that, right? Like, but the idea of Jamstack is like this thought that there was a broader architectural change that would affect how we build for the web in general, where like static sites would have a role to play in that and would be important for that, but it's not like we did fundamentally see it as something larger than that, right? Like, in more of an architectural approach that also had to do with like, where do you actually over time get the content and products, and how do you populate those, and how do you think about those services, where again, in the olden times, those were all part of like your WordPress with WooCommerce and 15 other plugins for search and SEO and so on, or your like big DXP platform and so on, right? Like, and it's kind of like the unbundling of all of that we were trying to capture.
Do you think that shift was inevitable, or what role do you think in Jamstack had in really cementing that shift?
It's hard to say, right? Like, I think there was a natural pull towards it, but someone also had to make it happen, right? Like, and I think Tom Preston-Werner put it really good very early on, like the founder of GitHub. We were talking to him early on about this need for like, we need some kind of category here. We need like, what do we call it? How do we talk about this? And honestly, when we first had the word Jamstack, neither me or Chris were very convinced that it was the right word. We were like, is it like the right word? Is it good enough? And so on. And I talked we sat down and had a drink with Tom and brought it up. And he was the one that said, look, Jamstack, it sounds good enough. Obviously, like, the details of what it means will probably change over time, but it's similar to like the famous blog post about Ajax, right? That was really taking some of the lessons from how Google had built like Gmail and so on, and then coining that term Ajax. Just someone coining that term really changed the world, because suddenly there was a shared language of like, that was broader than, okay, the browser has this XML HTTP thing built in now, we can do stuff with it. But there was certainly like, you could talk about like using Ajax to build applications with, right? Like, and it changed the minds of a lot of us and changed what people build, right? Like, and Tom was the first to just point out, like, Jamstack, it sounds like it could do that, right? Like, it could be like the nomenclature that unlocks this change by giving a lot of different people a shared vocabulary around it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think we saw that play out from 2015 onwards. Like, there's really an explosion of you know, it connected people, right, around the central idea that wasn't happening in kind of all the kind of individual parts of Jamstack.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was also what we tried to do, right? Like, we tried to be very connected around it, right? Like, so we just reached out to anyone that were doing stuff in that space, and it was like, hey, why don't we talk about it in this way, so we have like a way of talking about it, right? Like, we need some vocabulary. And we never, I mean, maybe later on there's been some critique that the term was not like super defined or something like that, but that was kind of exactly a symptom of that we were not like taking like a strong, like, I'm the one that decides what this term means and no one else can have input. We are taking much more of a community focused approach to say, okay, we know there's this change happening, like, let's try to build shared vocabulary around it.
For sure. So let's talk about that. Like what's the, the term has evolved a lot since 2015. What are like the underpinning core values that have stayed true since then?
To me, the core piece is really this part of like turn the web UI into its own self-standing stateless app that you can deploy on its own easily, right? Like, and reason about it individually without like coupling the data layer, the business logic layer, all of those underlying pieces, right? Like that's like the foundation for me. And then there's always been this notion of like being able to build as much of that upfront as like ready-made application, right? Like there, I think we've seen much of that shift of making some of like, think about early on when there wasn't any option to also, as part of that stack, run serverless functions or edge functions and so on, right? Like at that point, logically, the only way you could add dynamic functionality was a pure single page app functionality, right? Like where you would run JavaScript in the browser and then talk to APIs from there. Now we have some options where instead of running the JavaScript in the browser and talking to APIs, you move some of that communication to the APIs to the edge layer, for example, right? Like to me, that's not like a fundamental, like you're now working with a completely different architecture, right? Like still have this self-standing UI application that you can run locally, you can run it on the edge, you can run it in all kinds of places. It'll still talk just as well to the different APIs it needs to talk to, and it's architecturally, structurally not a different way of working and thinking than through a single page application. But it does start opening up just from the tool set, have to blurring the line more, right? Like suddenly you get next 14 demos with SQL in your React components and so on, right? Like, and that's for sure. Once you're doing that, you're certainly in a very different world than this like cleanly defined, like let's have the UI be stateless, self-standing, and then have well-defined APIs that we talk to, right? Like, so it blurs the boundaries.
Yeah, I'm keen to explore that a little bit. So there are things that are very clearly not Jamstack. A WordPress site that is dynamically rendering its content. That's that's the opposite end of Jamstack, and the reason Jamstack exists. Then there are things that are clearly are Jamstack, like a purely static website that is served on a CDN. That like middle, you mentioned it's a spectrum.
It's funny you say that, like we actually had that discussion early on. Is that even, if it's really just a purely static site, we ended up saying like, it kind of is a subset of Jamstack, right? Like, but we actually had that discussion early on. Like, is that even Jamstack if it doesn't actually talk to any APIs that's part of building the site? Or it's like, if it's really just a pure HTML site, is that actually Jamstack? It like, so I wouldn't say it was like that natural, because in the beginning that was like, okay, that's also like a side of the category where we're almost not doing anything. We still found that, it is Jamstack, right? Like, because it's still like, you're just not using all pieces of it, but you're at least not breaking like the conceptual model, right?
Yeah. Like, I feel like it adheres to like all the core values where it is decoupled. It's just, there's nothing it was coupled to in the first place. And like those principles of developer experience, scalable, security, like those are all true. Like I'm a big believer in static websites, and we build, I really like having that constraint. Like we build this tool called PageFind. It's made by one of our engineers, smart guy, Liam Bigelow. And the whole idea of it is it's an open source project that can index a purely static website. It could be like 10,000 pages, and create this index that's all sharded up. Then the search itself, on the client side, it knows which shard to use. So you can have this search across 10,000 pages and have a very small payload, which, working in those constraints, you you don't need to use like Algolia or a third party or set up your own search infrastructure. It's like purely static and kind of has all those advantages of Jamstack. Like, how do you kind of weigh up on that spectrum? Like, the more like kind of, as you mentioned, the more dynamic you go, the more you kind of get away from those core values.
Yeah, I mean that's the part where I think, to me, it's still that core decoupling of concerns, right? Like that the boundaries have to be there, right? Like if you do, and then you have to accept that there's some trade-offs, right? Like let's say you have a pure single page app and you move some of the data fetching to happening like streaming during render time at the edge, but it's still fetching from exactly the same API with exactly the same contract as when it was JavaScript running in the browser. Again, that's like a sliding scale where you still have all of the same sort of mental model of the simplicity of the UI, where you still can get the same rapid pace of development of that UI, because you're never tied to like a change to your UI might involve like a database migration, or it might break with the old schema or something, right? Like you have that clear like separation. You might start having some issues where they're fairly limited compared to like the WordPress architecture or something like that, but you can start having some security issues that could happen in that streaming layer, that just maybe have access to some environment variables and so on, where now you have to pay a bit of it like in mind, and that over time can challenge some of the maintenance simplicity. Because like imagine, let's say you were building with some front-end framework in version 3 of that framework, right? Like, and then you're not really doing anything to that project for like half a year, which is like in front end, it's like dog years, right? Like, so that you multiply with 7, and then like the framework is now on 18, and all the dependencies have completely changed and so on. And now you get notified that the old version of dependency you use have been compromised, and there's like a security issue that potentially it would allow people to get at that environment variable. And now you have to go back and say, oh, I have to update that dependency, but now but the whole world has changed. So now you have to suddenly like go from version 3 to 15 of the front end framework and re-architect everything and so on, right? Like some of those things can like there's this sliding spectrum, right? Where the more you depend on that logic layer to have access to stuff that's not available on the client, and the more you make it, like the more you're coupling those pieces together, and the more you'll start seeing these kind of like maintenance security issues, right? Like, but at the same time, I'm just saying that to me, it's still a pretty sliding scale. And if you want some like clear, absolute, here's the cut, I don't really think it exists. But I think there's just like this notion of like, whenever you can avoid having those issues, it's probably a good idea, right? Like you'll get the benefits of like the simplicity, the security, the scalability, but you might sometimes find that there's some of the constraints in terms of like, what do you do with truly massive product catalogs that still need to hit people that are mainly focused on a first load on a mobile phone and so on, right? Like where moving some of that initial like rendering and so on just makes sense to shift it one layer from the browser to the edge. And if that's the only shift you're making, you're not necessarily making much of a trade-off, right? Like it's still the same APIs you're talking to. It's still essentially the same kind of code you're running. It's just a small step of where it's running, right? Like, but on the other hand, if you suddenly revert back to saying like, I'm no longer distinguishing between building clearly defined APIs and self-standing front ends, but like I'm just mixing it all together, then you're in a completely different world, right?
Yeah, I think another kind of layer on that spectrum is on the purely static side. You have something that's completely portable, and I can take that to basically any web host in the world and deploy it, and it will work. and it's not saying that like that's better than dynamic or serverless or anything, but it is a trade-off you're making once you get into the serverless world. Now you're tied to a platform for that functionality on your website. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think there's something there, right? Like in the sliding scale of like when does it go from one to the other?
Yeah, that's what I've been really interested with Jamstack is kind of grappling with this, because I think serverless and like all the functionality that you provided is so powerful, but it makes it hard to talk about the trade-offs if it's like all under the one umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you I watched the Compose conference last week. It was awesome. Really cool to see like all this that activity in this space. Maybe you can talk us about that transition from Jamstack to Compose. What that was. What was the behind that?
Yeah, totally right. Like, so I think in the end, Jamstack is as a nomenclature, right? Like if you think in the same way as Ajax has a nomenclature, it's really a nomenclature that's aimed at like, as web developers, how do we take these trade-offs when building for the web, right? Like, and it's very specific to front-end web developer nomenclature in a way that similarly where Ajax would be really relevant if you're thinking about how to build like the next Gmail at the time when that came out, from a front-end perspective, but not so relevant if you're trying to figure out like what was like the full architecture that Google used behind Gmail that made it possible to offer like lots of gigabytes of data when everyone else was restricting you to a few megabytes and so on, right? Like, so in the similar way here, Jamstack is really like, I think still a useful nomenclature to talk about like our trade-offs as web developers. But then when you start thinking about, okay, if a large company wants to start like re-architecting their core web architecture from the broader sort of monolithic approach where they've typically bought a DXP or an e-commerce platform or something from a single vendor that includes like everything from inventory management to search to content to product catalog to pricing to the visual editing of that, to like a lot of companies have done that and then realized that, okay, when we've done that, we're like stuck in that world of having bought some big off the shelf system and it's take it or leave it for all of it, right? And now our developers can't build with like a Jamstack approach, and our individual components, some of them are really feel outdated, but we can't swap them out. It's like one all or nothing, right? Like, how do we get away from that? And there, the description of that re-architecture process is more the description of like, how do we build from that monolithic world to a composable architecture where we start splitting apart those big monolithic systems into individual components where as a company we can pick best in class for each of them. And how do we think about like the UI layer as its own component that's not coupled to our CMS or our commerce platform or our search engine or whatever, right? Like, but that we can iterate on in isolation, which again becomes a possibility when you adopt the Jamstack approach and not when you go full monolith, right? Like, but it's sort of a subset of that, right? Like where the broader composable thought is like, how do we architect our whole system, right? Like, and for us as a company, we're sort of ready now to help businesses go through that journey of like monolith to composable and modernizing their web architecture in general. So that's sort of more of the category change we're speaking to now, where again, if I'm out talking to developers, I still think like I still think Jamstack is really like relevant term in many ways. On the flip side, I just also think that it's kind of a given to a certain degree nowadays. I think it's starting to maybe not be as much, and maybe it will become relevant again, right? Like, but I just think that there was a switch from like an era where the normal for everyone, if they didn't give it any thought and they were starting a new project, was like a monolithic app with WordPress, Drupal, Shopify, Ruby on Rails, something like that, to a world where that's today really the exception if you're doing that, right? Like if like now most people will think like, okay, I should like build a self-standing, I should build with some front-end framework that's really just meant to power my front end and doesn't have an opinion on the back end. And then I should like build the back end separately and build these different APIs and services.
That is really interesting, Matt. Like, I think that it's always fascinating watching Netlify and seeing the moves you make, and yeah, it's just had a huge influence on the whole web development community. Thank you so much for joining today. I think we should do a lot more of these, bring more people in, and keep trying to figure out what that next step for the Jamstack community is.
Absolutely. We'd love to. There's a lot of fun, and always have a good time catching up with you.
Always. Thanks, Matt. Have a good one.
Thanks so much.